Hello, fellow miners at the coalface of meaning, and welcome to week 3. The lecture in week 3 is going to be about finding and citing sources, and this, part 1, will deal with the question of how you find and evaluate a source. Okay, let's get started. Finding and citing sources. We cite so we don't plagiarize. That's the simplest way of explaining why it is that we have to cite. But right away, that brings up a question. Everyone keeps talking about plagiarism, and I'm scared because I don't really know what it means. What exactly is plagiarism? Okay, let's stop for just a second. In every area of art, academia, car mechanics, actual painting art, people will sometimes employ terms without ever defining them, as if you ought to just know what they mean. That is a way of trying to exclude certain people from the conversation. It's basically a way of saying, you don't know what this means, so you're not part of the in crowd. I hate that, okay? So as we go along, I'm going to try to define everything that I mentioned that might be what's called a term of art. Something that you might not know the definition of. This time, I'm going to try to give you a clear definition of plagiarism. What exactly is plagiarism? Plagiarism is when you use other authors' ideas, theories, or words without acknowledging that you have done so. If you don't acknowledge that you're using another author, and that acknowledgement is called citing an author, that is plagiarism. Now, there are a number of different forms of plagiarism, as the first sentence here suggests. The most basic form of plagiarism is taking a quotation from someone else and passing it off as your own work. What does that mean? If you use someone else's words without acknowledging that they are someone else's, you have plagiarized. So if you just interpolate them into your own essay, that's plagiarism. It's the most basic form of plagiarism. If you use someone else's words, but you put quotation marks around them to indicate that they're someone else's words, but you don't provide an acknowledgement that they're someone else's words, you have essentially committed plagiarism. This is why we cite our sources, because they are an acknowledgement that what you're saying was originally someone else's words or ideas. Have you knowingly taken a quotation or a paragraph or even a whole essay from someone else without informing your reader that you have done so? This is bad. It's illegal. It's punishable. Don't do it. There isn't much in academia about which I am wholly serious, but this is one thing about which I am wholly serious. Do not take someone else's words and pass them off as your own. There are a couple of reasons for this. 1, would you want somebody to do that to you? I don't think you would. 2, this is illegal. It is punishable. It is morally reprehensible. 3, and maybe most importantly, it's just dumb. Let's talk about how it's dumb, just for a minute. You are paying upwards of £9,000 a year to come and get an education. When you plagiarize somebody else's words, you're not getting an education. You're just repeating what somebody else told you. So basically what you're doing is you're paying £9,000 a year for the privilege of not learning anything. And that's just stupid. So don't do that. Now, let's move on. A slightly less obvious form of plagiarism, taking someone else's ideas and passing them off as your own. That means you don't quote directly from the person, but you take what their words mean, the thought, the idea, the point, the line of reasoning, and use that in your work without acknowledging that you read it somewhere else. You need to cite when you use somebody else's ideas. And I know that that raises questions, and I'm going to try to answer them as we go along. But first, let me give you an example. On page 46 of his book, Mr. Smith says, in the story of Cain and Abel, Cain seems to be the aggressor, but in fact, he's the victim of God's preference for Abel. You don't write those exact words. In your essay, you write, when Cain kills Abel in Genesis, at first it looks as if he's the aggressor, but actually he's a victim of the fact that God prefers Abel. These are not Mr. Smith's words, but it's Mr. Smith's idea. This is also plagiarism. Okay, how do you fix it? It's very easy. On page 46 of his book, Mr. Smith says what he says. You repeat the idea, although not word for word. When Cain kills Abel in Genesis, at first it looks as if he's the aggressor, but actually he's a victim of the fact that God prefers Abel. Then you acknowledge it. You put a citation. You put the author's surname and the page number in brackets after the idea that you have taken from the author. Problem solved. A pesky form of plagiarism, accidental plagiarism. A source you've read said something so well that it's stuck in your head and you find you've accidentally repeated it in your essay. This is actually relatively common, but you can fix it by proofreading all your essays and taking care to add citations where you need them. How to fix it? Proofread all your essays with an eye to plagiarism before you hand them in. Now, one question that's often raised at this point is, this didn't happen, but what happened is somebody said something in their article and that made me think in a whole new way. So I thought a thought that's an original thought, but it's based on this thought. If that's the case, all you have to do is put in brackets, okay, this thought springs from an idea of Mr. Smith on page 46 of his article. That's all you need to do. Final form, volunteered plagiarism. Have you written an essay for someone else? You plagiarized. Has someone else written an essay for you and have you handed it in? You've plagiarized. Like lending and tango, volunteered plagiarism takes two. In the case of volunteered plagiarism, both are guilty. Okay? And I want to stress to you again that knowingly plagiarizing is bad, illegal, and punishable. And if I know that you've done it, I'll do my best to get you kicked out of school. Don't do it. We're all scholars now. You're scholars because you're studying. I'm a scholar because I'm studying too. Scholars shouldn't steal from each other. We're a community, and an endangered one at that. Now, let's talk about the form of plagiarism that everyone worries about. What if I say something or have an idea in my essay that someone else has had in a source out there somewhere, but I don't know about that source? My God, what then? Stop. Answer time. Stop. Hammer time. Go with the flow. It is said if you get through the list, you probably all get some way. Your hands in the air. Here is the answer. This is not plagiarism. This is an accident and a coincidence. Be not afraid. You don't have to go out there and read every single source on your topic just to be sure you haven't had the same idea as any of them. Okay? People have similar ideas. They have ideas similar to ideas that they didn't know other people had. Okay? If you don't know that someone else has had the idea before you, you are not copying it. You are simply coincidentally having the same idea. So don't worry about that. Selecting sources. Okay, pay attention. Here we go. Or as we might say, stop selecting sources time. Broadly speaking, first look for scholarly sources. What are scholarly sources, Dr. Emily? I'm glad you asked. Books published by a scholarly press, a university press, or other academic presses, articles in scholarly journals, and sometimes YouTube videos in which scholars discuss works. What do I mean by sometimes? I mean if it's a video of a lecture, for example, if you're writing about a contemporary author and it's a video of an in-depth interview with that author, those can be considered scholarly sources. If you're not sure if something is a scholarly source, ask the leader of your seminar in any module, not just this one. Addendum. If your text has been published recently, it's possible that there will not yet be any scholarly work on it. It takes time for people to notice and write about a work. In that case, it is perfectly acceptable to turn to book reviews or other articles in the media. That was Humphrey's tale. Humphrey is very concerned with getting a word in about reviews and scholarly sources. Depending on the nature of your text, for example, if it's a play, here comes Humphrey again. For example, if it's a play, reviews may also be a perfectly legitimate source. So there you go. Please be aware that the short articles on the British Library page and other scholarly library pages are not really scholarly sources. They're actually guides designed to sort of give gentle help in reading. That was Humphrey too. Try to find a more scholarly source, right? As detailed on this slide here. Everyone's favorite research first stop, and in fact, these days, more and more, everybody's favorite last stop too, the internet. The internet is full of information, but not all that information is reliable. Not all sources are accurate or trustworthy. Okay? If you use internet sources, be sure they are accurate and trustworthy. Now, the first thing I want to say, because I don't think there's a slide for this, is use your common sense. You're getting a sense for what's a legitimate source, how those sources talk, how they present their ideas, what it means to have scholarly argument or intellectual argument. So think about, whether or not your source sounds like that. Okay, that's the first step. Second step, rule number 1, look for a full author's name. First name, surname. If you can trace a story, comment, analysis, or fact, because not all facts are facts, back to someone, that means that someone is willing to take responsibility for it. Don't trust information if no one is willing to put their name on it. Try to use only sources that have an author's first and last name attached. Addendum to Rule 1. If you're writing an essay about audience response to a text, comments on sites such as Goodreads, YouTube, Twitter, etc. may actually be important sources. In that case, a comment doesn't need a full name, but it still needs some sort of handle that you can trace it back to. You've got to have someone who, well, more than anything else, you've got to have someone that you can list in the works cited, if it's a secondary source. Rule 2, consider the source. There are sources that have names attached, but are not necessarily reliable sources. Joe Milburn's COVID information page has a full name attached, but it's not going to be as trustworthy as the Center for Disease Control, COVID information, even if this page does not have a first and last name attached. In the same way, a page that's called something like How Labor is Destroying the Country is not going to be a very reliable source. This is where common sense comes in. Use your common sense. Rule 3, make sure it's a fact. In a non-scholarly source, and even in some scholarly sources, if you find something that's presented as a fact, find at least one other reliable source, which means a source with an author's name from a reputable source. Consider rules 1 and 2. Excuse me. And that repeats that fact. Only then can you be reasonably sure it's a fact. So basically, if two reputable sources identify it as a fact, you can be reasonably sure that it's a fact. Rule 4. If you're going to use a dictionary, use the Oxford English Dictionary. The OED, that's how it's known to those on the inside, is considered a scholarly dictionary. It gives not only the common definitions of a word, but all its historical definitions, with quotations to show the history of a word's being used in a given way. This makes it not only reliable and comprehensive, but also quite an enjoyable read. I really enjoy the OED. And it's worth bearing in mind that it's an extremely good source if you're doing historical work to find out how a word was understood in the period that you're talking about. Meanings often change radically. Rule 5. The following are not acceptable sources: Schmoop, book rags, spark notes, cliff notes. These are study guides. Broadly speaking, study guides are insufficiently sophisticated for the kind of analysis that you're doing. They're also basically just somebody's opinion, or the gathering of somebody's opinion. Blog posts written about texts, also not acceptable. These really are just somebody's opinion, right? If somebody has some analysis of Pride and Prejudice that they've just kind of made up, okay, that is not what's called peer-reviewed, which means that other people in the profession have read it and consider it valid, okay? That's just somebody's opinion. Watch out for blog posts. Rule 6. Try to begin by using the MLA database. On the home page for students, that is the one with all the pains, I can't get to it, there's a link search tool that takes you directly into JSTOR, which is a database. But in fact, JSTOR contains only records of journal articles. Its name means journal storage. The MLA database will search all scholarly journals, books, and essay collections that have been published worldwide since the beginning of the MLA, which is 1883. So, as you can see, it's going to offer many, many more sources for you. Go to the MLA database and use the MLA database. And now, I will show you how to use it. And if you feel like you need a break, this is a very good place to stop the video and have a break. It is also a place for me to close out and for me to go ahead and talk about the catalog, but just a moment.